Hello and welcome. I present to you the creation of Not So Missile Command, Red Menace. I've not done any video recording in the past. The quality is a bit iffy, apologies for that. As you can see, after blocking out the scene, I started on the Crosshair. Crosshair represented the player input for firing the missiles. I picked out a nice asset from the Unity asset store. And the player would control this with WASD. Next up was implementing the missiles. So whenever the player presses space, a prefab is instantiated and the missile will translate from the origin to wherever the player was aiming at the time. Enemy spawning was quite a fun one today. So the game manager had a timer on it, and at regular intervals it would instantiate one of the prefabs for the enemy. The enemy would be spawned at a random position across the top of the screen, and then would be given an index for one of the cities at random to target. Here I'm adding an explosion script, so when the missile from the player input reaches its destination, it creates an explosion, and if the enemy interacts with it, it is destroyed. And now I'm starting to set up the SFX manager, so I took what I built for the group work, stared at Stack Overflow for a while trying to figure out what exactly I was trying to do, and then built something that plays one-shots upon being called by any script. Next, I started setting up the power-ups. So initially I only worked on the first two power-ups, the health regen and the shield, mostly because the Vector maths was a bit funky for the multiple missile one. And here, after fixing a little bug with the enemy's translation, I started implementing the effects of the power-ups onto the cities. From here I start using assets from the Unity asset store again for the missiles, just to make it look nicer. I was starting to polish at this point, so the missiles now rotate to face towards wherever they're firing, and I implemented the same piece of code on the enemies as well. Now I've reached the UI portion, so here we have a dynamic score in the top left, and I wanted to add a pause as well, which I ended up scrapping this version and opted for something that actually worked and looked a lot better at the end. So this dreaded power-up was slightly more difficult to make. What I did is I took the vector for the missile that had been instantiated, and I normalized the vector. I figured out the perpendicular of the vector, and I added it on both sides, so when it split it would create a new vector target for two new missiles. So everything from here is post our session on Tuesday, and I started working on a new way to spawn the power-ups, which felt a bit more dynamic and contextual to the game that I was creating. And here I started setting up a new enemy type, which would use the same plane for the power-up spawns, but would drop a nuke at a random position on the map. Now this was arguably the biggest pain. The dynamic silo was whenever a missile was fired, it would remove a sprite from the silo. But the issue was I wanted to add an upgrade function, which would mean that the script would have to change what it was doing halfway through. This was messy at best, but it worked in the end. And the almighty nuke was from a piece of feedback which would take multiple hits to destroy and would deal multiple points of damage. Feat a functional pause menu. So after the feedback session, I decided to implement a number of features based on the feedback. I wanted to add an enemy variant which did multiple points of damage and would hit multiple cities and would move at a different pace from the rest of the enemies. I settled on the nuke given the context of Missile Command. I also wanted to use the score system to implement upgrades for the player. So the silo would be increased from 3 to 5 missiles at a time upon reaching a certain threshold. I think I settled on 4,000 at the end, but this can be changed as a public float. I also wanted to give context to the spawning of the power-ups as per somebody's suggestion during the feedback session. So I decided it would be better to add a quote-unquote friendly AI who would airdrop in the power-ups as little care packages for the player. And now I'm going to stop rambling and let you watch the finished thing. I've set up 2 gameplay videos, one which shows all features and you winning, and the other one losing.